By far, the most popular title in the Souls series is Dark Souls. This game caught on like a narcotic. It was released to widespread critical acclaim, praised the sun flooded message boards, and before FromSoft even knew it, Dark Souls had become a phenomenon. To this day, Dark Souls is one of the most recognizable games, notorious for its brutal difficulty. That's all well and good, and I'm glad the Souls series was able to expand beyond Demon Souls. However, I highly doubt many of the existing Souls fans originated from Demon Souls. That game sold better than Atlus expected, but it was nowhere near the runaway hit that was Dark Souls. I'd be willing to wager most of the Souls fans exist because of Dark Souls. I know that Dark Souls was how I was introduced to the series, even though I was never able to finish it until after I completed Bloodborne. It begs the question as to whether or not Dark Souls is a fitting sequel to Demon Souls, even though technically it's a spiritual successor. It's a complicated thing to grasp, since Sony still owned Demon Souls assets and namesake, and Dark Souls was published by Namco-Bandai. FromSoft kinda ripped their own game off, somehow managing to retain the Souls moniker while skillfully dancing around the copyright trademark battlefield. Regardless of the publishing copyright mumbo-jumbo, it's generally accepted that Dark Souls is a proper sequel. Since Dark Souls is mostly derivative of Demon Souls, I would like to examine what it adds and what it may well detract from the Souls experience, then transition into an evaluation of the game on its own merits. Before we begin, I'd like to explain how I've gone about gathering footage for this game. I own the PC version, and I've modded it heavily so that 1, it works, and 2, find out if Dark Souls can achieve something of a higher quality than the base game. Considering I was able to get it running with high-res textures, anti-aliasing, and a stable 60 FPS with relatively little issue, I'd say the definitive Dark Souls experience is on PC, provided you're willing to deal with the headache of setting everything up. Since I've messed around with the game, I can't say it's necessarily fair to evaluate the game based on PC-exclusive mod fixes that eliminate a few performance issues. As a result, I have acquired footage from the Xbox 360 version of the game from a YouTuber known as Nero Mystera, who uploads a host of high-quality, no-commentary playthroughs of a variety of games. Through this, I hope to give a fair and honest evaluation of the game as it was released, and compare it to what's possible on PC when it's warranted. Now that that's out of the way, it's time to review Dark Souls. Dark Souls follows a similar plot structure to Demon Souls. We learn of the kingdom of Lordran and the pretext to the wasteland it now exists as. There's stuff about war between the dragons, the Age of Fire, the Lord Souls. The opening cutscene essentially exists to make you aware of key characters you'll be meeting later on. In that way, it makes boss encounters feel like a bigger deal than they otherwise would. Aside from that, you're once again left to put the pieces together yourself. What has changed narratively largely has to do with how your player character is portrayed in the world of Lordran. In Demon Souls, it's made known that many people come searching to lay the Old One to rest and save Boletaria, and you are by no means an exception. You just happen to be a lot better at killing shit. Lordran feels a lot more hopeless. There's very clearly no one trying to stop anything, and NPCs sort of just stick around and do things because that's what they've always done. People like the various blacksmiths aren't really helping you because it'll help you save Lordran, they're just doing it because it's all they've ever been known to do. The crestfallen warrior, returning from Demon Souls, will tell you to go ring 2 bells and see what happens. Yet, you never see him going to do it. He sits with a grim tone in his expression, implying that he's given up all hope and just wants to toy with you since you're likely the first human face he's seen in a long time. In the Nexus, there were countless people who wanted to see you save the world. Thomas stored your items to help you on your quest. He was friendly, despite his family tragedy, and likely wanted to see you bring it to the man, as it were. One of the friendliest NPCs in Dark Souls, Lautrec, just wants to teach you firebending because you saved him. There's really no evidence he cares about the world either, but he certainly cares about you. It's easy to see that Lordran is very fucked and almost no one cares about it anymore. One moment traversing the castle walls, and I can't say I blame them. It has the same atmosphere as Demon Souls, with abandoned castle walls infested with undead creatures. The only person who really seems to give a damn about the world is Oscar, who saves you from your prison in the beginning, and he dies as soon as you meet him. I've always thought there's a little bit of symbolism in that. The one who was hell-bent on ridding the world of the undead scourge died before he ever got anywhere. And then you come in. Oscar saved you, and after he explains his life goal, you feel indebted to him. After all, without him, you wouldn't have your newfound freedom. Why not spend that freedom fulfilling Oscar's dying wish? His wish was to go ring the Bell of Awakening, and that's your goal, really. Stop the undead outbreak. I'd be remiss to not mention Solaire, since he's arguably the most popular character in the game. His goal is to see the sunlight once again, and to make a long story short, his noble and hopeful goal drives him insane, and you end up having to kill him at the end of the game. You can save him, but it's highly unlikely you'd even know how without looking it up. All of this stuff sets an air of hopelessness. The people who actually care about the world are dropping like flies, with an insurmountable threat looming in the horizon. There are a bunch of people sitting around in isolation to wait for their inevitable death. It's as if Lordran has entered a perpetual state of limbo, where nothing changes and despair is inevitable. You're the only one doing anything worthwhile, and when you finally get to the end, after slaughtering every demon in the damn kingdom, it's likely no one even notices. Solaire and Oscar are dead, and everyone else is just going about their business as usual. You were just a pawn, playing a game of chess that no one bothered to come watch. Dark Souls makes you feel insignificant, and that helps to build a sense of achievement when you defeat an impossible threat. Therefore, your drive isn't necessarily to save the world, but to show the world you mean business while respecting the wishes of the man who saved you. I find it slightly more compelling than the plot of Demon's Souls, which has you coming to Boletaria in hopes of saving it, and pretty much doing just that, unless you're me and choose to merge with it. It's a very subtle improvement, while still maintaining the minimalistic approach to storytelling found in Demon's Souls. There's one change I feel is quite significant, and is a point of contention between some fans: the change to open world. Miyazaki and his team elected to ditch the level select format and pursue an open world to assumedly create a more authentic world. There's really almost no contesting this when you look at how it enhances the feeling of immersion. One of them is clearly more realistic than the other, and having to trek through every inch of Lordran gets you more invested in that world than you otherwise would if you just had a level select screen. The argument starts to worm its way in when you look at it from a gameplay perspective. The old linearity versus non-linearity argument, and boy is this a complex debate. So Demon's Souls struck a very nice balance between the two, with a focus on linear level construction and non-linear level selection. It's sort of like what A Link Between Worlds did with set dungeon designs, but allowing you to tackle them in any order you want. I feel like Demon's Souls did a great job eliminating any sort of frustrating wall of impossible by allowing you to go do something else in the form of trying another level. Dark Souls has a more open world, but it isn't as free as you would initially think. Open world implies there's a number of places to go, but there's really one place you need to be going in the beginning. That entails a linear section where you make your way to the bell, not unlike the beginning levels of Castle Boletaria. About half of the game is a linear destination, making your way through the castle, Blighttown, Sen's Fortress, and Anor Londo until you're given some sort of choice as to how you want to proceed. To a greater or lesser degree, this mirrors a similar issue in the Zelda community surrounding 2D and 3D Zelda, and how linearity should be approached. The 3D games feel more linear, whereas the 2D games give you a lot more freedom. There's an endless debate about why one is better than the other, and why one direction is clearly the better one for Zelda's future. In both of these debates, it often feels like linearity is made out to be something that's inherently bad and should be avoided. In the case of both the Souls games and the Zelda games, they were intended to be exploratory and take you on an adventure, which is something that many people bring up as the reason they should be more non-linear. But when people say Dark Souls is much more linear than Demon's Souls, and that Ocarina of Time is much more linear than A Link to the Past, they often forget that there's a whole lot more to do in those games other than advancing the plot. In Ocarina of Time, you can go shoot some Poes in Hyrule Field, or collect heart pieces scattered throughout the world, or play the shooting gallery in Gerudo Valley. There's a whole host of other things to do and experience in Hyrule, and I think it's unfair to label Ocarina of Time as being linear when its linearity stems from its story progression, something that A Link to the Past also does. In the case of Dark Souls, while a portion of the game is quite linear in terms of how you progress the main plotline, after you defeat Ornstein and Smough, you can tackle the 4 Lord Souls in any order you choose. Do you want to fight Seath the Scaleless in the Duke's Archives, or do you feel like navigating the depths to fight Nito? The choice is yours. Even leading up to that point, there are still a number of optional things you can do in Lordran. If you want to go to Blighttown early and have the Master Key as your starting item, you can go below the Firelink Shrine and access Blighttown early. If you're really determined, you can brute force the boss and ring that Bell of Awakening first. While I didn't tackle Quelaag first, I did take the shortcut into Blighttown and was clearly underleveled for the boss. However, I was curious to see how long I could last. Little did I know, I was able to predict her attack pattern, punish accordingly, and after about 15 minutes, she was dead, and I felt extremely accomplished. You can definitely still go out of your way to do things the game doesn't force you to complete. If you really want to, you can travel back to the tutorial area and fight another boss. That can be missed entirely, and it's yet another thing forgotten when arguing about Dark Souls and linearity. While Dark Souls on a base level is technically more linear than Demon Souls, really they equal out in the end. Even though Demon Souls lets you pick things from the get-go, Dark Souls has enough to do that isn't forced on you that it's really a negligible difference. So no, I don't think Dark Souls is more linear. In fact, the approach that Dark Souls takes with its open world is something I ultimately prefer over Demon Souls. As I mentioned, it adds another level to the world building, but it also succeeds in making the adventure feel seamless. There were a lot of loading screens in Demon Souls, and even though they weren't substantial enough for me to mention, I feel that in comparison to Dark Souls, it can take me out of the experience sometimes. Dark Souls has shorter, less frequent loading screens that allow you to explore Lordran with relatively little headache. In my opinion, Dark Souls takes what Demon Souls established with authentic geography and realistic AI and manages to improve it ever so slightly by creating an open world where everything feels connected. I've had several moments where I was taken aback by the sheer scale of Lordran. It's graphically impressive, sure, but it connects in ways you could never fathom until you actually experience it. When you make it all the way through the Undead Parish, through dragons and armored boars and a giant juggernaut, you happen across an elevator. You activate it and sit for a while, wondering where it's taking you. When you finally see the light, you take in your surroundings and realize this is the Firelink Shrine where you started your adventure. You've just made it full circle, and that's when you realize that Lordran is broken up into a series of gigantic levels. You have the biggest of them all with the castle, Undead Parish, Sen's Fortress, the depths, Blighttown, the graveyard, all of this shit that can be accessed without any sort of cutscene or warp or anything. Then when you're transported to Anor Londo, you have the entire castle to explore, the Painted World, the Duke's Archives, the Crystal Caves, all of that shit. You could even argue that it's all one gigantic level, even though your transport to Anor Londo isn't as seamless, because Anor Londo is located directly above Sen's Fortress. This is absolute genius world building, something I'll praise Xenoblade Chronicles for until the end of time. The fact they were able to achieve something on this grand of a scale with relatively little drawback is so goddamn impressive. Unfortunately, there are drawbacks. The area that everyone collectively hates, and I don't particularly blame them, is Blighttown. This poison-infested, moth-filled cesspit suffers from horrible slowdown, with an otherwise stable 30 FPS dropping substantially in every corner of the swamp. This is one of the bigger complaints about the game, and one that I absolutely agree with. Despite how much I love the open world aspect of Dark Souls, I feel they may have been able to sacrifice some visual fidelity to make the game run at a stable 30 on consoles. The fact of the matter is, Blighttown sucks on consoles, and there's really no way of circumventing it, unless of course you're on PC. I was able to get Blighttown running at 60 FPS with no lag at all. It takes a shit ton of horsepower, and my PC actually crashed one time, but I'd say it's absolutely worth it in the end if you've got the technology. It doesn't change the fact that millions of people suffered through the horrendous performance issues in the console version, and I do take that into consideration while I evaluate these games. I'm not blindsided by my own preferred platform, even if I do achieve better results on that platform. Now, attaining 60 FPS on consoles would have been nice, but I just don't think it would have been possible without serious serious consequences in other departments. To achieve a stable 60 FPS, Dark Souls would likely need to undergo a serious downgrade in visual fidelity and remove various sections of the game so there was enough memory to bolster the performance. No doubt 60 FPS is better than 30 FPS, and I'm glad that I can play it at 60. But if I had to play on console, I don't think I would have sacrificed the authentic feel of the game for better performance. This is one of those rare cases where I would choose 30 instead of 60, just because I wouldn't be okay with what they would need to sacrifice to achieve a stable 60 FPS. There's no changing the fact that the consoles just can't handle something like this without suffering, and I really don't fault FromSoft for compromising their performance for the sake of their artistic vision. I'd say that Demon's Souls had a better grasp on its performance, but it also wasn't as ambitious, so it was likely easier to achieve a stable frame rate for 95% of that game. Nevertheless, Dark Souls still kinda dropped the ball, and I can't go ignoring that. Progression has been left relatively untouched. You still collect souls from enemies and use them to level up. Except now it's a lot more convenient, because you can level up at any bonfire, which this game uses as its checkpoint system. Light a bonfire, rest at it, and you now respawn at that bonfire. Whenever you rest at a bonfire, including whenever you die, all of the enemies respawn, unless they are a specific type of enemy that has permadeath, like the armored boar in the Undead Parish. Unfortunately, something that returns from Demon's Souls is that sometimes repetitive motion of running into the boss after you die and having to go through the same enemies in the same formations several times over. It still feels repetitive, and I'm still not okay with it. What I will say is that it's more bearable than Demon's Souls, since there are way more bonfires scattered around Lordran, and that makes the trek to each boss a lot less agonizing. One thing I don't mind is having to walk everywhere before you obtain the Lord Vessel. The world isn't as huge as you might think, and even though traveling from Blighttown all the way up to Sen's Fortress seems daunting, no matter which way you entered Blighttown, you can take the shortcut back. This means you just need to go through the shortcut to the Firelink Shrine, take the elevator up to the Undead Parish, walk to the blacksmith a few hundred feet away, and boom, there's Sen's Fortress. The game is designed so that you never need to constantly backtrack to make it where you need to go. And when the world does start to get gigantic and lead you into dead ends, you're given the Lord Vessel to quickly traverse the giant world and ensure you don't have to backtrack because of a dead end. In that respect, Dark Souls keeps traveling simple, quick, and easy while still retaining the feel of an open world. Another change comes in the healing system. Something I elected not to talk about in Demon's Souls was the grass system, since I didn't really have a positive or negative opinion regarding it. I was really saving it for this video so I could compare the Estus system to the grass system. So I'm just gonna come out and say it. The Estus system is the best healing system in any Souls game, bar none. You start off with 5 and can kindle up to 10, 15, and even 20 as the game progresses. They all restore at a base rate, and even though they can be made more powerful, each Estus will always restore the same amount. They do technically run out, but whenever you rest at a bonfire, they will all regenerate to at least the minimum 5, and most of the time you'll have kindled, so they'll refresh to the max amount you kindled to. This eliminates one pretty major gripe I have with Demon's Souls, but more so a gripe I have with Bloodborne, which we'll get into when I cover that game. In Demon's Souls, your consumable items are just that, consumable. Eventually, you'll run out of your grass and need to either farm more or buy more. To that end, there are various types of grass that restore varying degrees of health, something I feel was necessary to account for your character's progression, but could have been handled a lot better so you don't need to cycle through 5 different grasses on your quick select and keep track of which grass heals which amount in the heat of battle. Estus is simple, never runs out, and is balanced out by enemies respawning whenever you rest at a bonfire. So you can't abuse the system to get more Estus to conquer a difficult portion, because then you'll have to do the section over again anyway. It gives you the choice of going in with 5 and challenging yourself, or giving up some humanity to make things easier and kindle up to 10. Everything is in your hands. There's no hassle to grind, no confusing grass system, you just drink your flask and restore health. Simple and clean. You may have heard me mention something called humanity, which is linked into a similar system from Demon's Souls. Think of humanity as a secondary currency you can collect, except you can't use that currency unless you ingest it. When you ingest humanity, the number at the top left raises, and you can now lose that humanity along with your souls whenever you die. Humanity is linked to a variety of different things. For one, you need humanity to become human again. When you aren't human, you're a hollow, and unlike Demon Souls, there's really no penalty for being hollow outside of an inability to kindle Estus and summon other players. It's kind of a shame there's no penalty for death, since it was a lot harder to become human in Demon Souls. It eliminates some of the tension associated with death, and I'd say Demon Souls handles its humanity system a lot better. In Dark Souls, you need to consume humanity, a pretty readily available resource, to become human. So even if they elected to keep the health nerf associated with dying, there wouldn't be much of a point because becoming a human again is almost instantaneous. I know that Demon Souls had Stones of Ephemeral Eyes, which I incorrectly referenced as Shards of Archstone in my review, but at the very least, it would have been more interesting if there was some penalty for death, but as it stands, the only consequence is having to repeat the same area again. Once again, when you're human, you can summon other players and be invaded. Also, when you're online, you can see bloodstains and messages from other players that range from helpful to your local praise the sun. Really, nothing has changed here, but it does bring up something I really want to talk about in regards to the Souls games and cooperation. Despite there being a system in place to provide help for players in the form of summoning, there's a subset of the Souls community that shuns people summoning other players to help with a difficult section or boss. Some also shun the very notion of getting help and condemn people from looking up guides and fear that it will soil the first-time experience. I understand where these people are coming from, and the first run-through of Dark Souls is one of the best things about it, as it is with any other Souls game. But when you're lost somewhere and just can't find the one key to open a locked door or something, is it really so much of a sin to look that information up? If you've hit an absolute brick wall with a boss, is summoning help really that bad? You still get to see it for the first time, see its moves, react to its difficulty, and you still get to take it down. There's still reward in that, and you're with another person, so it's probably even more rewarding to have received that reward in good company. I'll just never understand the fans that think they know what's best for everyone. I know it's coming from a good place, but I would suggest the community calm down and let people decide how to play the game. Let Dark Souls stand on its own. Trust me, it really doesn't need defending. It sets things up in a simple fashion so that even if players struggle, they'll be able to find their way through in a way that makes sense to them. And for all those out there who feel pressured by the community, do us all a favor and please don't. You'll love the game that much more if you play by your own instinct, and it'll lead to a more memorable first playthrough, trust me on this. Let me also reiterate that this is a very small minority of Souls fans, and I am in no way indicting all Souls fans when I say this. I just know that I've seen how some players react when someone gets help using a completely optional system in the game. If you don't want help, you don't need to take it, but they clearly do, so let them play their way. With that semi-rant out of the way, let's discuss something that's somewhat of a problem with the perception of the Souls series. Dark Souls quickly became notorious for its brutal difficulty. If you have any doubt of this, the version I'm playing is subtitled Prepare to Die Edition. If that doesn't spell out what Namco-Bandai's marketing division is flaunting, I have no idea what will. You may recall back in the Demon Souls review I mentioned that difficulty was only one small part of the greater Souls experience. But that's a little harder to market to a general gaming audience. It's far more effective in marketing to focus on one unique selling point and sell consumers based on that point. The thing praised most heavily in Demon Souls was its difficulty, and Namco-Bandai caught on quite quickly that there was a niche audience willing to support a game that will kick their ass. In that way, it was an effective marketing campaign, and to this day, Dark Souls has sold about 5 million copies and spawned a successful franchise that currently has a third game on the way. However, I would not be surprised if this aggressive marketing campaign has put some gamers off, since the perception of the game's difficulty has been blown through the roof. No doubt, if new players wandered over to the graveyard their first time around, they'd put the game down instantly, because they'd assume the rest of the game is that impossible. I would like to demonstrate how fair Dark Souls actually is, and attempt to dispel the notion that these games are impossibly hard. The marketing is all hyperbole, and even though Dark Souls is a lot more challenging than your average game, it's definitely not impossible. It's easiest to start from the beginning and work our way up. The tutorial area begins in a prison, which you are given a chance to break out of. Almost nothing is a threat here besides the boss. You should be able to acclimate yourself to the controls in enough time to take on the boss. New players may struggle here, but it's worth noting that his attack pattern is quite easy to predict and his moves have an extremely slow wind-up time. Plus, you should have already taken out a quarter or so of his health from your air plunge attack. I wouldn't say there's anything about this tutorial that's designed to frustrate you, besides a rolling ball that takes everyone by surprise. Even then, it's incredibly unlikely the ball will kill you. When you land in Lordran, you have two paths. One of them has skeletons that one-shot you, and the other has some fairly weak undead enemies. Gee, I wonder which one is the right path. I mean, there's also the New Londo ruins under the Firelink Shrine, but it's also very clear that you aren't supposed to go that way, considering you can't even damage the ghosts. So when you go along the correct path, there are moderately difficult enemies, but nothing too extraordinary. Eventually, you make it to your first real boss. He's giant, there's a narrow battlefield, and he can be quite tough. But no doubt, if you dodge his attacks and punish passively, you can make it through normally. You're bound to notice the ladder behind you at some point, and then you learn you can do the air attack on him you learned in the beginning. All of a sudden, he doesn't seem so threatening. I will say that the section with the bridge is a bit unfair since you have no way of avoiding it even if you could predict it from the burn marks. You can run all you damn well please, you're gonna get scorched once, and I think that's a bit unfair. Thankfully, right after is a shortcut to an earlier bonfire. I don't have to go through all those enemies again? All of a sudden, this game seems pretty forgiving. It's fair, the best kind of challenging. It's a bit rough around the edges, and there are a few sections that seem like they're designed with trial and error in mind, but the majority of the game is paced well in that respect. The exception, as many would point out, is the latter half of the game, where the perfect beginning flow seems to rapidly fluctuate and seems a bit messy in execution. You have beings like Seath the Scaleless hyped up in the beginning cutscene, only to be one of the easiest bosses in the entire game, with a completely predictable attack pattern. Then you have this strange requirement in New Londo Ruins where you need to get a ring from a boss fight and equip it to survive a bottomless pit. It is after a fog door, so the player knows this is the way to go, but it's almost a bit too obtuse for my taste. Then the boss is just 4 copies of the same thing that go down extremely easily. Then there's the lost Izalith clusterfuck of a reskinned asylum demon, a bullshit centipede boss in an incredibly small arena surrounded by lava, and the Bed of Chaos, which has a cool concept, but falls in the same category as the Dragon God because it's a fucking Lord Soul. Initially, I saw the concept of a boss with 1 hit point to be awesome. Then I noticed that it throws out a barrage of attacks at random and seems designed to absolutely obliterate you. All the boss ever amounted to was pure trial and error, and when I finally got to the core, it just felt like luck. The latter half of the game just seems like it had a lot of wasted potential, but then again, there's also a bunch of cool stuff in the latter half. I really enjoyed the section where you're thrown in prison and need to escape the Duke's archives. Enemy AI behaves in a strange way, with the lizard men running up to the exit at the sound of the music. I was uneasy in the catacombs since it was pitch black and I was navigating the unknown with giant skeletons lying in wait. Unflooding the New Londo ruins and finding out there's a whole another layer to the city was one of the most memorable moments in Dark Souls. It screws with your perception of the level and connects the area to the Valley of Drakes while also making the level 10 times larger. I fucking love when games toy with your expectations like that. Yeah, the game definitely could have used some work, but it was still paced well enough in the beginning that I can forgive it starting to deteriorate slightly near the end. Most of the bosses are fun anyway, and I actually prefer the bosses in this game over the ones in Demon's Souls. While Demon's Souls had its share of great bosses, Dark Souls one-ups that attempt by crafting its bosses to make you feel something. I think the best example of this is with Artorias and Sif. You're likely to first encounter Sif, although you can tackle the DLC before fighting him. Artorias is a boss fight in the DLC where you encounter a knight who came to save a peaceful town from a dark monster lurking below. You see a once great knight shifting in odd ways with a rather unorthodox fighting style. When I first fought him, I knew there was something off. He felt possessed by something, be that rage, despair, darkness, or even just another person entirely. I didn't want to fight him, since I pieced together that he was the knight who went to save everyone, and he obviously failed in his mission, much like Oscar. His loyal guardian, a wolf named Sif, guards over his grave in the future, and when you encounter him, he fights you with his master's sword. Is it to protect his master even in death, or is it to prevent you from befalling the same fate? It's a battle that neither of you want to happen, but it still happens. I don't want to kill Sif, but Sif is set on stopping me from becoming something I regret. This is infinitely more deep than 2 gargoyles at the top of a tower. Not that Dark Souls isn't guilty of that, because there are literally 2 gargoyles on a roof, except I think the bell gargoyles are designed slightly better than the man-eaters. For one, they're actively attacking you, so the fight feels like it goes by a lot faster. There's also a lot more room to fight, even though you can still fall off the roof. It's not dark as fuck, so it's easier to see them, and the both of them look different, so it's easier to distinguish one from the other. I recognize how much of this is nitpicking, but I never said the man-eaters were badly designed, just not as good as the bell gargoyles. If you aren't convinced, since they are both pretty similar, let's look at Ornstein and Smo, the boss fight you will remember if nothing else. This is also a two-person fight, but it's with two entirely different entities. They would be quite easy on their own, but their attacks complement each other in sequence, with Ornstein being quick and Smo being heavy and strong. If that isn't enough of a challenge, when you beat one, the other regains all of their health and absorbs their dead partner to power up substantially and wreck you all on their own. It's such a dynamic fight, and it's one of the most memorable Souls experiences I have. I have frustratingly vivid memories of retrying this boss over and over and over again to no avail. Eventually I had to use Solaire as bait, and even then I kept dying. This is one of those cases where I can easily argue that Dark Souls isn't built on frustration. The fight is fair and gives you ample choice to hide behind pillars and play the fight safe. There's nothing bullshit about Dark Souls' bosses, save for the stuff in Lost Izalith. I just think this is the peak of the Souls series bosses, and they did a tremendous job making each one feel rewarding, even if some were easier than others. I haven't even mentioned the DLC yet, which is one of my favorite pieces of DLC in video game history. That might sound a bit dramatic, but I love everything this piece of DLC represents. Sure, it's paid for content in a $60 release, but it was developed after the game came out, later packaged with the base game for free, and is one of the best areas in the entire game. It takes place in Lordran, but set 200 to 300 years before the events of the main game in a place called Oolacile. It feels like a twisted mix of Alice in Wonderland and the Wizard of Oz, in an enchanted forest with deranged scarecrows, ghosts, and what I swear to you is the Cheshire Cat himself. The DLC starts a bit surprisingly, with an immediate fog door to a griffin boss. He is really challenging, but you can memorize his attack pattern quite quickly and hope your motor skills can follow. I beat him on my first try, much to my amazement, but it's not as if it was an easy victory. From there, you travel through the ominous woods into the Colosseum where you fight Artorias, and then into the fallen town of Oolacile with creatures that have gone to absolute shit. You keep descending further into darkness, into a cave with ghosts chasing you around. You even save Sif down here, which can trigger a small alteration in the cutscene when you meet him in the future where he recognizes you as his savior. Finally, you fight Manus, Father of the Abyss, responsible for fucking up Oolacile and Artorias. You'd think it would be over, but there's yet another boss fight, which is the dragon foreshadowed near the beginning. The process of fighting him involves finding him in a valley, realizing you can't get him down, asking a blind giant to shoot him down with his bow. By the way, that's one of the most badass things ever, and you go fight the limp dragon. Despite being limp, he's a really fun fight, and I think one of the only times they've done a dragon well in a Souls game. Spoilers for the next review, wink wink. It was fun to do right before Gwyn, because I thought it was a great build up to the climax. You learn what parts of Lordran were like when they were still a tiny bit hopeful, but still really fucked. There were people who still somewhat cared, like Artorias, and through that you can better understand Gwyn without having ever met him. You enter his fog door and immediately fight him, no words spoken, no cutscenes to be had. He just walks up to you with his flame katana and goes through the motions, like he's done this so many times it's become reflex to him. He wasn't all that hard, but something about him made me feel like he wanted to die after all these years. After all, he's fucked up for prolonging the Age of Fire. When I killed him and kindled the flame, the game ends. Just like that. It gave me time to reflect. I really haven't accomplished much, have I? I was a pawn. I killed Gwyn and all of the Lord's souls, but there are still monsters, and I just burned up. Even in the other ending, you just become the next Gwyn in a matter of speaking, and the new Age of Darkness doesn't sound much more appealing than the Age of Fire. It's as ambiguous as the story, and I love that so much. It leaves such a diverse, rich world to be dug into by theorists on the internet, and believe me, there are people out there who have uncovered all this game has to offer from a lore standpoint. I don't have that kind of time, but I still read Wikia pages from time to time just to learn more about this amazing world. Because I'll come out and say it, I find Lordran more interesting than Boletaria. It's interconnected, there are characters I care about like the Blacksmith and Lautrec, areas like the Lost Izalith and Ash Lake look absolutely gorgeous. It's just on a scale like nothing Demon Souls could ever offer. Dark Souls is a powered up Demon Souls, which is what a proper sequel should be. I won't say it's without its issues, and I'd even say Demon Souls is slightly more coherent and polished. Honestly, in my eyes, they're both equally competent, and as I said in my Demon's Souls review, it really just comes down to personal preference. In my case, I ultimately prefer Dark Souls, but I know a host of people who prefer Demon's Souls, and that's totally fine. What I took away from Dark Souls was more meaningful than what I took away from Demon's Souls, and to me, the pros vastly outweigh the cons. It's safe to say that even though I started with Bloodborne, Dark Souls is my favorite game in the Souls series. It's one of those rare times where I can totally understand the overwhelming praise that a game gets. Before I jizz all over this game for another couple of hours, I'll just leave it at this. Dark Souls is amazing, and the experience you have is something you'll likely never forget. It's true, immersive fun that isn't scared to provide an ample challenge set in a lore-rich world that's infinitely more interesting than our own. And that alone is worth the price of admission. It didn't end with Dark Souls though. While Miyazaki and his A-team were off working on a new Sony exclusive, a new team in FromSoft went to work on the sequel, Dark Souls 2. Next time I'll be discussing Dark Souls 2 in much the same way, but until then, have a fantastic day and certainly have some well-deserved fun today.